Ephesus, 41 BCE. Dawn breaks over the Temple of Artemis, and with it comes death. The assassins show no reverence for sacred ground. They seize a young woman from the altar and end her life. Her name is Arsinoe IV, and she dies because her sister couldn't sleep soundly while she lived. History remembers Cleopatra, the seductress of Caesar and Antony, the last pharaoh of Egypt. But Cleopatra knew the rival she truly feared wasn't a Roman general, but her own blood. The sister who was her mirror in ambition, the one she had to have murdered on holy ground. This isn't a tale of simple betrayal. It's about two brilliant women trapped in a game where only one could survive, and the winner had to erase the loser from history itself. Tonight, we're peeling back the propaganda to reveal the shadow history of Arsinoe IV. Not a victim, but a player who nearly won. If you enjoy these tales where the line between hero and villain dissolves like morning mist, consider subscribing and dropping a comment with where you're listening from. I'm curious who else knows that sisterhood can be the deadliest bond of all. So take a slow, deep breath. Settle into your coziest spot. Let the modern world fade away as I take you to Alexandria, where two sisters learned that in the Game of Thrones, only one queen can survive. The Ptolemaic court was a place where children learned to count not with numbers, but with the bodies of their relatives. In the winter of 51 BCE, as the teenage Cleopatra VII ascended to the throne, alongside her younger brother Ptolemy XIII, the palace on the island of Pharos buzzed with the particular energy that accompanied a new reign. Servants scurried through corridors lined with painted scenes of divine pharaohs, their sandals whispering against floors of polished marble that reflected the light of countless oil lamps. The air was thick with the competing scents of frankincense from the royal altars, cedarwood from Lebanon, and underneath it all, the faint but persistent smell of fear that permeated every Ptolemaic succession. For nearly 3 centuries, this dynasty had ruled Egypt through a simple and terrifying formula. Marry your siblings to keep the blood pure, then murder them to keep the throne secure. It was a system so refined by repetition that it had become almost ritualistic. The palace walls themselves seemed to remember the screams. Ptolemy VIII killing his nephew during his own wedding feast, then years later sending his sister-wife proof of their son's fate as a cruel birthday gesture. Arsinoe II, watching her brother Ptolemy Keraunos killed her children from a previous marriage before their wedding ceremony was even complete. In this charnel house of a court, young Arsinoe IV had learned the most valuable lesson of all. Invisibility was survival. While her eldest sister Cleopatra commanded attention with her sharp wit and linguistic brilliance. She spoke 9 languages fluently and could debate philosophy in the original Greek. Arsinoe perfected the art of being overlooked. She was the 3rd daughter, neither heir nor spare, existing in that dangerous middle ground where royal children were most likely to simply disappear. She dressed plainly, spoke when spoken to, and moved through the palace like a shadow, always present but never quite noticed. But shadows see everything, from the alcoves and window seats where she positioned herself with scrolls she pretended to read. Arsinoe watched. She observed how their father, Ptolemy XII Orleats, had survived his own exile by learning to read Roman moods like weather patterns. She studied how Cleopatra wielded charm like a surgeon's knife, precise and devastatingly effective. She memorized the way their younger brothers, Ptolemy XIII and XIV, were being shaped by their tutors into competing claims to legitimacy, each programmed to view the others as obstacles to be removed. Most importantly, she learned to think like a queen while appearing to be nothing more than a student. The palace's great library became her true classroom, while others attended formal lessons in rhetoric and mathematics. Arsinoe haunted the stacks where the histories of their dynasty were kept. She read every account of every succession, every civil war, every political marriage that had ended in assassination. The papyrus scrolls painted a clear picture. In the Ptolemaic Game of Thrones, sentiment was weakness, family was competition, and mercy was the luxury of those who didn't intend to survive. She was 17 when the lesson became personal. Their father had been dead only months when the first cracks appeared in the carefully constructed partnership between Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII. The boy was barely 14, but his advisors, chief among them the eunuch Pothinus and the general Achilles, had grand ambitions. They whispered in his ear about the old pharaonic traditions, about how Egypt had been ruled by god-kings, not god-queens. They spoke of the impropriety of female rule, conveniently forgetting that the dynasty's greatest pharaoh had been a woman named Hatshepsut over a millennium earlier. The palace, already thick with intrigue, became suffocating. Servants chose sides with the careful calculation of people who knew their lives depended on backing the right horse. Meals became exercises in political theatre, each course an opportunity to signal loyalties or test allegiances. The very air seemed to crackle with unspoken threats. Arsinoe watched it all from her carefully cultivated position of irrelevance. She attended the same dinners, walked the same corridors, but nobody bothered to lower their voices around the forgotten sister. She became a repository of secrets, a living archive of who had said what to whom, who had made which promises, who had been seen entering whose chambers in the dark hours before dawn. And then Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria like a thunderclap, pursuing his defeated rival Pompey across the Mediterranean, and everything changed. The great Roman general landed with only a handful of ships and a few thousand men, but he carried something more powerful than any army, the authority of Rome. The civil war between him and Pompey had torn the Republic apart, and now the victor had come to collect the debts Egypt owed to Roman moneylenders. More than debts, actually. He had come to decide which of the young Ptolemies would rule, and on what terms. Arsinoe found herself in the palace's eastern tower on the morning Caesar made his dramatic entrance, seated in a window alcove with a scroll of Herodotus open on her lap, pretending to study while actually watching the harbour below. The Roman galleys cut through the blue water of the great harbour like bronze knives, their red sails billowing in the autumn wind. She could see the bustle of activity on the palace's private quay as officials scrambled to prepare a reception worthy of Rome's new master. But what captured her attention wasn't the spectacle of Caesar's arrival. It was her sister's reaction to it. Cleopatra stood on the palace's main balcony, resplendent in cloth of gold that caught the morning light and threw it back in brilliant flashes. Even from a distance, Arsinoe could see the calculation in her sister's posture, the way she held herself like an actress preparing for the performance of her lifetime. This was the moment Cleopatra had been preparing for, the crisis that would either establish her as the undisputed pharaoh or destroy her utterly. What happened next would become legend. Cleopatra's midnight visit to Caesar, smuggled into the palace in a carpet, a dramatic gesture that combined audacity with seduction to devastating effect. But Arsinoe, watching from the shadows, saw something else in her sister's gambit. She saw the moment when Cleopatra chose Rome over Egypt, foreign protection over domestic legitimacy. It was a brilliant political move, perhaps the only move available, but it was also, Arsinoe realized with crystal clarity, a betrayal that left the throne of the pharaohs vulnerable to a different kind of claim. That night, as the palace buzzed with whispered accounts of Caesar's fascination with the young queen, Arsinoe sat alone in her chambers, staring out at the harbour where Roman ships now controlled Egyptian waters. The oil lamp beside her flickered, casting dancing shadows on the painted walls that depicted the eternal triumph of the pharaohs over their enemies. For the first time in her life, the invisible princess allowed herself to imagine a different outcome. Not as the forgotten sister, not as the overlooked spare, but as the rightful ruler of Egypt, the pharaoh who would drive out the Roman invaders and restore the nation to its ancient glory. The game had changed, and Arsinoe IV was ready to play. In the harbour below, Caesar's ships rode at anchor, their bronze rams gleaming like teeth in the moonlight. Tomorrow would bring new negotiations, new alliances, new opportunities for those clever enough to seize them. The palace slept, but in the eastern tower, a young woman who had spent her life learning to be invisible began to plan how to make herself impossible to ignore. The pieces were already in motion, and the forgotten sister was about to become the most dangerous player on the board. The opportunity came wrapped in chaos, as the best opportunities always do. By the winter of 48 BCE, Alexandria had become a city at war with itself. Caesar's presence in the palace had ignited the simmering resentments of a proud people who had watched their pharaohs bow to Roman bankers for generations. The streets echoed with angry voices speaking in the harsh consonants of Egyptian, not the refined Greek of the court. Merchants shuttered their shops, dock workers abandoned the harbour. The great city that had once been the intellectual capital of the world now smouldered with the particular fury of the colonised. From her window in the eastern tower, Arsinoe could see the smoke rising from the museum quarter, where Caesar's soldiers had accidentally set fire to part of the great library while fighting off angry mobs. The irony was bitter as burnt papyrus. The Romans, who claimed to bring civilization, were literally burning the accumulated wisdom of centuries. Each scroll that crumbled to ash was another piece of evidence that her sister's alliance came at a price too terrible to calculate. But Arsinoe saw more than destruction in the flames. She saw opportunity. The palace had become a gilded prison. Caesar's Praetorian guards, ostensibly there for protection, watched every movement with the cold efficiency of professional killers. Meetings were monitored, conversations were reported, even meals had become performances, with every gesture scrutinized for signs of disloyalty. Cleopatra, for all her newfound security, was as much a captive as a queen, dependent on Roman goodwill for every decision, every breath. But in the chaos of urban warfare, even the most careful watchers could be distracted. The escape happened on a night when the north wind brought the sound of battle from the Egyptian quarter. Caesar's men were fighting house to house against an enemy that melted away like mist, only to reappear behind them with knives and stones. The palace guards had been reinforced with men pulled from Caesar's already stretched forces, leaving the inner apartments less carefully watched than usual. Arsinoe had been planning this moment for weeks, noting patrol patterns, memorizing guard rotations, cultivating relationships with servants whose loyalties lay with Egypt rather than Rome. Her maid, a girl named Eras who had grown up in the palace, proved invaluable, not for what she said, but for what she left unsaid. A loosened bar in a ground floor window, a servant's cloak left carelessly draped over a chair, a kitchen door that would remain unbarred for exactly 1 hour after midnight. The forgotten sister slipped away like smoke, leaving behind the careful invisibility that had protected her, and stepping into a role she'd been rehearsing in secret for months. By dawn, she was with the army. The Egyptian forces camped outside Alexandria's walls were a revelation. Here were no perfumed courtiers or calculating eunuchs, but soldiers whose weathered faces spoke of campaigns in the southern deserts and northern deltas. They were commanded by Achilles, a general whose loyalty to the Ptolemaic throne had never wavered, even as that throne was occupied by a queen who seemed more Roman than Egyptian with each passing day. When Arsinoe walked into their camp, accompanied only by her old tutor Ganymedes, a eunuch whose Egyptian birth had always set him apart from the Greek-educated advisors who dominated the palace. She was taking the greatest gamble of her life. She could have been arrested as a runaway, returned to Caesar in chains, or simply eliminated as an inconvenience. Instead, she was hailed as a saviour. The soldiers saw in her what the palace courtiers had overlooked, a Ptolemy who spoke their language, who understood their grievances, who had risked everything to stand with them against the foreign invaders. Here was a pharaoh who had chosen Egypt over Rome, the ancient crown over foreign gold. When they knelt before her in the morning mist, their armour clanking against the hard ground, it wasn't mere ceremony, it was a coronation. Arsinoe IV was no longer the invisible sister, she was a queen. But queens, she had learned from her extensive reading, were only as powerful as their ability to eliminate rivals. Her first test came immediately. Achilles, for all his Egyptian loyalties, was still a general of the old school. A man who had served under her father and viewed royal women as figureheads to be protected and managed. He accepted her presence, but he clearly expected her to remain a symbolic leader while he made the real decisions. The dynamic was patronising and, more dangerously, politically unsustainable. A queen who did not command was not a queen at all. The solution came from an unexpected source. Her old tutor, Ganymedes. The eunuch had spent decades in the palace, watching from the servants' quarters as the great families manoeuvred for power. He understood better than anyone that legitimacy without authority was worthless. When tensions between Achilles and the royal household reached a breaking point, Ganymedes presented Arsinoe with a choice that would define her reign. She could accept Achilles' protection and remain a puppet, or she could eliminate him and take real command. The order, when it came, was delivered with the casual efficiency that had characterized Ptolemaic rule for 3 centuries. Achilles, summoned to a private council meeting, found himself facing not a discussion but an execution. The method was swift, professional, and left no doubt about who now commanded the Egyptian forces. Some of the veteran officers were shocked, others were impressed, all understood the message. The teenage queen was not her father's daughter in weakness, but her dynasty's heir in ruthlessness. With Ganymedes as her general and the army firmly under her control, Arsinoe began to wage a war that was as much about propaganda as military strategy. Every victory against Caesar's forces was proof that Egypt could resist Rome. Every Roman soldier killed was evidence that the invaders were not invincible. Every day that the great Julius Caesar remained trapped in the palace quarter was a demonstration that a teenage girl could accomplish what the greatest generals of the Republic had failed to do. The water wars became her masterpiece. Caesar's forces, confined to the palace and harbour districts, depended entirely on the city's ancient aqueduct system for fresh water. It was a vulnerability that previous attackers had never thought to exploit, but Arsinoe and Ganymedes saw it immediately. Using the same engineering expertise that had built the Great Library and the Pharos Lighthouse, they turned Alexandria's water supply into a weapon. The mechanics were ingenious and terrible. Teams of workers, labouring under cover of darkness, constructed massive pumping systems near the harbour. Using wheels and pulleys, they began forcing seawater into the freshwater channels that supplied the Roman-controlled areas. The salt contamination was gradual at first, just enough to make the water unpalatable, then increasingly severe until Caesar's men were drinking brine that left them retching and dehydrated. The psychological effect was even more devastating than the physical one. Caesar's legionaries, veterans of campaigns from Gaul to Germania, found themselves reduced to digging desperate wells in courtyards, their confidence shaken by an enemy they could not see or fight. The great general himself was reduced to the humiliating expedient of sending foraging parties to find fresh water in a city he claimed to control. But it was the battle for the Pharos Lighthouse that truly announced Arsinoe's arrival as a military force. The lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the world, rising over 400 feet above the harbour entrance, was more than an architectural marvel. It was the key to controlling Alexandria's great harbour, and whoever held it controlled the city's lifeline to the Mediterranean. Caesar understood this, which was why he had stationed his best marines on the island and connected it to the mainland with a heavily fortified causeway. Arsinoe's assault came at dawn on a day when the autumn winds whipped the harbour into white-capped fury. Her ships, manned by Egyptian sailors who had learned to navigate these waters as children, attacked with the precision of a surgeon's blade. The first wave carried fire ships, hulks loaded with pitch and oil that turned the water around the lighthouse into a lake of flames. The second wave brought Marines trained in the brutal close-quarters fighting that characterized naval warfare. The battle raged for hours, fought on narrow stone causeways slick with seawater and chaos. Caesar himself was forced into the fighting, leaping from ship to ship as his position collapsed around him. At one point, according to the sources that would later try to minimize the humiliation, the great general was forced to abandon his flagship entirely, tearing off his purple commander's cloak and swimming to safety, while his enemies closed in around him. When Arsinoe's forces captured that purple cloak, the symbol of Caesar's supreme authority, and displayed it from the lighthouse's peak, it was more than a military trophy. It was a declaration that the most powerful man in the world could be defeated by a teenage queen who refused to accept that Egypt was Rome's to give away. The victory sent shockwaves through both camps in the Roman-controlled palace. Caesar's officers whispered about their leader's mortality for the first time. In the Egyptian camp, Arsinoe was no longer just a queen but a legend in the making. The pharaoh who had humiliated the conqueror of Gaul. But legends, Arsinoe was beginning to understand, were dangerous things. They inspired fierce loyalty, but they also attracted fatal attention. Every victory made her more powerful and more vulnerable, more essential to Egypt's resistance, and more threatening to her sister's carefully constructed alliance with Rome. As winter deepened into spring, the siege settled into a brutal stalemate. Caesar's reinforcements were coming. Everyone knew that, but until they arrived, Alexandria belonged to whoever could hold it. The city had become a chessboard where every move carried mortal consequences, and the two players who mattered most were sisters who had learned to think like queens and hate like enemies. In the end, it would not be Roman legions that decided the fate of Egypt, but the calculations of a dynasty that had turned fratricide into an art form. The betrayal came from within, as betrayals always do in the Game of Thrones. By the spring of 47 BCE, Arsinoe's position had become both stronger and more precarious than ever. Her forces controlled most of Alexandria. Caesar remained trapped in the palace quarter, and Egyptian resistance had become the talk of the Mediterranean world. Merchants in Rhodes spoke of the queen who had made Rome's greatest general swim for his life. Senators in the Forum whispered about Caesar's unexpected vulnerability for the first time since Actium. Roman invincibility seemed like a myth that might be shattered by Egyptian determination. But strength, Arsinoe was learning, could be its own weakness. The veteran officers who had initially cheered her bold leadership were growing weary of Ganymedes' authority. The eunuch, for all his intelligence and loyalty, was still a palace creature, a man of scrolls and strategies rather than sword and shield. The soldiers respected his tactical brilliance, but they chafed under his discipline, particularly his habit of executing deserters and looters with the same cold efficiency that had once characterized his administrative duties. More dangerous still were the whispers about legitimacy. Arsinoe was a Ptolemy, yes, but she was also a woman commanding an army in a tradition that had always been dominated by men. Some of the older officers, veterans of campaigns stretching back to her father's reign, began to mutter about the unnaturalness of taking orders from a girl barely out of childhood, no matter how brilliant her strategies or devastating her victories. The conspiracy crystallized around a simple but seductive idea. Why not trade the untested queen for the proven king? Ptolemy XIII, Arsinoe's younger brother, remained Caesar's captive in the palace, but captivity, the conspirators reasoned, might have taught him valuable lessons about Roman power and Egyptian independence. Perhaps the boy had learned to hate his captors. Perhaps he could be turned into a more manageable figurehead. one who would take orders from experienced generals rather than issuing them to eunuchs and foreign advisors. The plot unfolded with the particular treachery that characterized palace politics. Secret meetings in officers' tents, coded messages passed between trusted subordinates, promises of rewards and threats of consequences, all conducted with a careful choreography of men who had spent their lives navigating the deadly currents of Ptolemaic ambition. Arsinoe, despite her extensive network of informants, only learned of the conspiracy when it was too late to stop it. The delegation that approached Caesar under a flag of truce was led by officers she had trusted, men who had knelt before her in the morning mist and sworn loyalty to her crown. Their offer was elegantly simple. They would deliver Queen Arsinoe in exchange for King Ptolemy XIII. Caesar could eliminate his most effective enemy, while they could reclaim a ruler who understood the proper relationship between generals and royalty. Caesar, trapped and running short of both time and options, saw the brilliance of the proposal immediately. Arsinoe had proven herself the more charismatic and competent leader. Every day she remained free was another day his reputation suffered and his position deteriorated. Trading her for her less capable brother was the sort of strategic masterstroke that had made him master of the Roman world. The exchange took place on neutral ground, a small island in the harbour where diplomats had met for centuries to negotiate truces and ransoms. Arsinoe, brought there under guard by men she considered loyal, maintained her dignity even as the full scope of the betrayal became clear. She wore the simple white linen of pharaonic tradition, her dark hair bound with golden circlets that caught the morning light and threw it back in defiant flashes. Caesar, meeting her for the first time face to face, found himself confronting not the barbarian queen of Roman propaganda, but a young woman whose composure under these circumstances bordered on the supernatural. Here was someone who had nearly destroyed him, who had turned his greatest triumph into his most dangerous humiliation, who had proven that Roman invincibility was a lie that could be exposed by Egyptian determination. Yet she stood before him without pleading, without tears, without any of the desperate bargaining he had expected. She was 19 years old and facing almost certain death, but she carried herself like a pharaoh meeting a foreign ambassador, polite, distant, and utterly unimpressed by his authority. The exchange was completed with bureaucratic efficiency. Ptolemy XIII, bewildered by his sudden freedom and uncertain about his new role, was transferred to the Egyptian camp. Arsinoe, now Caesar's prisoner, was escorted to the palace under heavy guard. The conspiracy, its immediate goal achieved, dissolved into the fractured loyalties and competing ambitions that would ultimately doom the Egyptian resistance. But if the conspirators thought they had solved their problems by trading queens for kings, they had fatally misunderstood both siblings. Ptolemy XIII, whatever lessons captivity might have taught him, remained what he had always been, a teenager controlled by advisors who were more interested in their own power than Egyptian independence. Without Arsinoe's strategic brilliance and charismatic leadership, the resistance crumbled with shocking speed. Within months, Caesar's reinforcements arrived, the Egyptian army was scattered, and Ptolemy XIII was dead, drowned in the Nile during a final, desperate battle that ended any pretense of organized resistance to Roman authority. Arsinoe, watching from her carefully guarded quarters as her brother's body was pulled from the muddy water, understood the final lesson of Ptolemaic politics. In the deadly Game of Thrones, competence was often more dangerous than incompetence, and the most successful players were sometimes the ones who ensured their own elimination. For 2 years, she remained Caesar's captive, a living reminder of Egyptian resistance kept under close supervision, while her sister consolidated power as Rome's client queen. The palace that had once been her childhood home became her prison, its familiar corridors now patrolled by foreign soldiers who watched her every movement with professional suspicion. But Caesar, master politician that he was, understood that prisoners could be more valuable than corpses. Arsinoe represented something powerful: Egyptian legitimacy, resistance to foreign domination, the possibility of alternative leadership. Killing her immediately would make her a martyr. Keeping her alive but powerless served multiple purposes. It demonstrated Roman mercy, neutralized a threat, and provided useful leverage should Cleopatra ever prove insufficiently cooperative. The real test came in 46 BCE, when Caesar returned to Rome to celebrate his victories with the traditional triumph that marked the pinnacle of Roman military achievement. The Quadruple Triumph, celebrating conquests in Gaul, Pontus, Africa, and Egypt, was designed to be the greatest spectacle in Roman history. For 4 days, the capital would witness parades of unprecedented magnificence, displaying the wealth and power that Caesar's campaigns had brought to the Republic. Prisoners, treasures, and exotic animals would march through streets lined with cheering crowds, all culminating in the ritual execution of enemy leaders at the Tullianum prison. Arsinoe found herself cast in the central role of the Egyptian triumph, not merely as a prisoner, but as the embodiment of a conquered nation. The preparations were elaborate and deliberately humiliating. She was fitted with golden chains, heavy enough to make movement difficult but ornate enough to emphasize her former royal status. Behind her would march a burning effigy of the Pharos lighthouse, a cruel reminder of her greatest victory transformed into a symbol of her ultimate defeat. The intended message was unmistakable. This is what happens to those who resist Rome, even queens, even pharaohs, even the heirs of Alexander's greatest general, could be reduced to entertainment for the Roman mob. But spectacles, like battles, sometimes produce unexpected outcomes. The Roman people, gathering in the tens of thousands along the triumph route, had come expecting to see the humiliation of their enemies and the celebration of their victories. What they saw instead was a young woman walking through their streets with such dignity that it transformed mockery into tragedy. Arsinoe, bound in golden chains and forced to march behind the symbol of her homeland's defeat, refused to play the role Caesar had written for her. She did not weep, did not beg, did not provide the satisfying spectacle of a broken enemy that would have justified Roman brutality. Instead, she walked with the bearing of a queen attending a religious procession, her head high and her gaze fixed on something beyond the jeering crowds and political theatre. The effect was electric and immediate. The Roman mob, expecting to cheer the humiliation of a foreign enemy, found themselves witnessing something that looked suspiciously like martyrdom. Here was a woman, barely 20 years old, facing death with a composure that put their own leaders to shame. The chains that were meant to symbolize her degradation instead became evidence of Roman cruelty. The burning lighthouse a reminder that they were celebrating the destruction of one of the world's greatest wonders. The crowd's mood shifted with the terrifying speed that characterized Roman politics. Cheers turned to murmurs, murmurs to groans, groans to outright expressions of sympathy and outrage. By the time the procession reached the Forum, Caesar found himself facing something no general wanted. A Roman mob that sympathized with his enemies more than it celebrated his victories. The political calculation was immediate and brutal. The customary fate for defeated enemy leaders was ritual execution in the depths of the Tullianum, a tradition stretching back centuries. Vercingetorix, the great Gallic chieftain, would meet that fate within hours, but Arsinoe's execution, given the crowd's reaction, would be a political disaster that could undermine Caesar's carefully constructed image as a merciful victor. In that moment, faced with a choice between tradition and pragmatism, Caesar made the decision that would define the rest of Arsinoe's life. He granted her clemency, not out of kindness, but out of calculation. The crowd's sympathy made her more valuable alive than dead, a living demonstration of Roman mercy rather than a martyred symbol of Roman cruelty. The announcement was made with typical Caesarian flair, emphasizing his generosity and wisdom while carefully omitting any reference to political pressure or mob sentiment. Arsinoe would be spared, he declared, as a gesture of respect for her courage and as evidence of Rome's civilized values, but mercy in the Roman system came with conditions. Arsinoe would live, but she would live in exile, removed from any possibility of political relevance. The Temple of Artemis in Ephesus, one of the 7 wonders of the world, a sacred sanctuary where political refugees had traditionally found safety, would become her new home and her final prison. As the triumph concluded and Rome celebrated its victories with gladiatorial games and public feasts, Arsinoe found herself facing a future that was both salvation and damnation. She had escaped death, but at the cost of everything that had made her life meaningful. She would live, but as a ghost haunting the margins of history, a former queen reduced to the status of a sacred prisoner in a foreign temple. Yet even in exile, even in defeat, even stripped of armies and allies and authority, Arsinoe remained what she had always been, a threat that could not be entirely neutralized as long as she drew breath. The golden chains were gone, but invisible ones had taken their place, bonds that would stretch from Ephesus to Alexandria, connecting a living symbol of resistance to a sister who could never truly rest while that symbol endured. The temple bells rang out across Ephesus like a funeral dirge, marking the hour when the impossible became inevitable. For 4 years, Arsinoe had lived in the shadow of the great temple of Artemis, a former queen reduced to the status of a sacred prisoner. The marble columns that surrounded her rose toward the sky like the bars of the world's most beautiful cage, and within their circle, she had learned to measure time not in days or seasons, but in the steady accumulation of proof that exile was just another word for a very slow execution. But in the spring of 41 BCE, as ships brought news of Caesar's assassination and the civil war that was tearing Rome apart, that slow execution was about to become terrifyingly swift. The news reached Alexandria like lightning splitting the night sky. Caesar was dead, murdered on the Ides of March by senators who thought they were saving the Republic. The man who had made Cleopatra queen, who had fathered her son, who had guaranteed her throne with Roman legions, was nothing more than a corpse on the Senate floor. In a single day, everything that Cleopatra had built came crashing down like a house of papyrus cards. The Queen of Egypt found herself facing the nightmare scenario that had haunted her dreams since the day she first seduced the great Roman general. She was alone in a world full of enemies, protected only by the loyalty of subjects who had watched her bow to foreign masters, ruling a kingdom that existed at the pleasure of men who had just proven their willingness to murder the most powerful individual on earth. Worse still, she had a son, Caesarion, the boy she claimed was Caesar's heir. In the brutal mathematics of civil war, that child was either the greatest asset imaginable or the most dangerous liability possible, depending entirely on which Roman faction emerged victorious from the carnage. The assassins would kill him to erase Caesar's bloodline. Caesar's allies would use him as a rallying point for their own ambitions. Either way, her dynasty's survival depended on choices made by men who viewed Egypt as a prize to be won rather than a nation to be respected. And then there was the other problem, the one that kept her awake during the long Mediterranean nights, when the wind carried the sound of waves breaking against the lighthouse her sister had once defended. Arsinoe was still alive. 4 years in Ephesus had not diminished the threat she represented. If anything, exile had transformed her from a military opponent into something more dangerous, a symbol. Every Egyptian who resented foreign rule, every aristocrat who remembered the old pharaonic traditions, every soldier who had fought against Roman occupation could look to the temple sanctuary and see proof that legitimate resistance was possible. More practically, Arsinoe remained what she had always been, a Ptolemy with a superior claim to the throne, a proven military commander, and a demonstrated willingness to fight for Egyptian independence. As long as she lived, Cleopatra's rule would always be vulnerable to the simple argument that a queen who served Rome was less legitimate than a queen who had defied it. The political mathematics were brutal and simple. In the chaos following Caesar's death, factions throughout the Roman world were searching for allies, symbols, and alternative sources of legitimacy. Arsinoe, the pharaoh in exile, represented all three. Any Roman general looking to challenge Cleopatra's authority could find no better weapon than her own sister, and any Egyptian conspiracy against foreign rule could find no better figurehead than the queen who had nearly driven Caesar into the sea. The proof came sooner than even Cleopatra's worst fears had anticipated. In Cyprus, her governor Serapion openly defied her orders and gave aid to Cassius, one of Caesar's assassins. The rebellion was small, easily crushed, but its implications were terrifying. It demonstrated that her authority was not absolute, that factions still existed who were willing to gamble on alternative leadership, and that Arsinoe's continued existence provided a rallying point for every disaffected element in the kingdom. When Mark Antony summoned Cleopatra to Tarsus in 41 BCE, she understood that this meeting would determine not just her political future, but her physical survival. Antony commanded the eastern provinces of the Roman world, controlled the legions that could either protect or destroy her kingdom, and possessed the authority to decide which Ptolemy would rule Egypt and under what conditions. She also understood that this was her opportunity to solve the problem that had haunted her reign since its beginning. The meeting at Tarsus became the stuff of legend, the Egyptian queen arriving on a golden barge dressed as Aphrodite, seducing the rough Roman general with a display of wealth and sensuality that left him utterly captivated. But beneath the theatrical romance lay a cold political calculation that would have made Ptolemy VIII proud. Cleopatra's seduction of Antony was not merely personal, but strategic, designed to create a partnership that would secure her dynasty and eliminate her enemies. She offered him the wealth of Egypt to fund his planned conquest of Parthia. She promised him the exotic pleasures of the East to satisfy his legendary appetites. She presented herself as the perfect combination of political ally and romantic conquest, the queen who could fulfill both his ambitions and his desires. But she also made a demand that revealed the true nature of their alliance. In the quiet hours after their public displays of mutual infatuation, when the crowds had dispersed and the diplomatic theatre had ended, Cleopatra presented Antony with the queen's calculus, the cold equation that had governed Ptolemaic politics for 3 centuries. For their partnership to work, for her dynasty to be secure, for their children to inherit a stable throne, the last remaining threat to her legitimacy had to be permanently removed. She asked him to kill her sister. The request was presented not as an act of sisterly hatred, but as a political necessity. Arsinoe represented an alternative source of legitimacy, a rallying point for opposition, a living reminder that Cleopatra's rule depended on Roman support rather than Egyptian acceptance. As long as she lived, every crisis would potentially become a succession dispute. Every enemy would have a ready-made replacement. Every conspiracy would have a legitimate figurehead. Antony, already drunk on Egyptian wine and Cleopatra's promise of unlimited wealth, agreed with the casual brutality that characterized Roman politics. He would prove his commitment to their alliance by eliminating its greatest threat. He would demonstrate that his loyalty to Cleopatra superseded his respect for Roman law, Greek tradition, and human decency. The assassination was planned with military efficiency and executed with the contempt for religious law that would later become a powerful weapon in Octavian's propaganda war against the lovers. Arsinoe, who had sought sanctuary in one of the most sacred places in the ancient world, would be murdered on the very steps of the temple that was supposed to protect her. The killers arrived with the dawn, showing no reverence for the sacred precinct or the ancient laws of sanctuary that had protected political refugees for centuries. They dragged Arsinoe from the altar where she'd been praying, to which gods, for what mercy, history would never record, and executed her on the temple steps. The act scandalized the ancient world. To murder a political refugee who had been granted sanctuary was a violation of laws both human and divine, a sacrilege that offended Greeks, Romans, and Egyptians alike. The high priest Megabezus, who had continued to address Arsinoe as queen throughout her exile, was arrested and nearly executed himself, spared only when the city of Ephesus sent an embassy to plead for his life. But for Cleopatra, the scandal was worth the security. The last Ptolemy who could challenge her rule was dead. The last symbol of Egyptian resistance to Roman authority had been eliminated. The last threat to her children's inheritance had been removed with the same clinical efficiency that her ancestors had brought to fratricidal politics. The Queen's calculus had been completed, the equation balanced with blood. Yet even in death, Arsinoe continued to haunt her sister's reign. The sacrilegious murder provided Octavian with perfect ammunition for his propaganda war, proof that Antony had abandoned Roman values for Oriental despotism. The image of a foreign queen ordering the execution of her own sister in a holy sanctuary became a powerful symbol of the corruption that threatened to destroy the Republic. More personally, the manner of Arsinoe's death shaped Cleopatra's own end. Having witnessed her sister's humiliation in Caesar's triumph, having ordered her murder in sacred sanctuary, Cleopatra was determined to avoid a similar fate. When Octavian's forces closed in on Alexandria in 30 BCE, she chose suicide rather than risk being paraded through Roman streets in golden chains. In her final moments, as the asp's venom coursed through her veins and the last pharaoh of the Ptolemaic dynasty prepared to join the gods, perhaps Cleopatra thought of the sister she had destroyed to secure a throne that would die with her. Perhaps she remembered the teenage queen who had nearly driven Caesar into the sea, who had walked through Rome with dignity in chains, who had spent 4 years in exile dreaming of the day she might reclaim her birthright. Or perhaps she thought only of the harsh mathematics that had governed their dynasty for 3 centuries. That power was a prize to be won. Family was competition to be eliminated, and mercy was a luxury that queens could never afford. The temple bells in Ephesus rang out across the ancient city, marking not just the death of a forgotten princess, but the end of an era when Egyptian pharaohs could still dream of independence. The serpent's shadow had finally fallen, and with it died the last hope that the land of the pyramids might ever again be ruled by those who loved it more than they feared Rome. In the quiet aftermath of ambition and betrayal, 2 brilliant sisters had played the deadliest game ever devised by mortal minds. Both had lost, and Egypt would never be the same.